The first serpent, before Eden had a name. Before the garden, before the fall. Listen carefully, not as a believer, not as a skeptic, but as a witness. Because what you are about to hear does not begin with humanity, and it does not end with sin. It begins before Eden had a name, before trees were sacred, before gods demanded obedience, before language learned to lie. It begins with a creature older than morality itself, the fragmented record. The first references do not come from scripture. They come from broken clay tablets, recovered from beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, from untranslated margins of Sumerian star charts, from oral warnings passed between elders who refused to write the name down. An Assyriologist once said, his voice barely steady, "There are stories that civilizations do not preserve, they survive them." This is one of those stories. Before creation had rules, long before humans spoke of heaven or hell, ancient cultures described a time they called the Unbound Age, a time when existence was unfinished. The sky had not yet learned its height, the earth had not chosen its shape, and life moved freely between forms. During this age, beings did not fall or rise. They changed, and among them was something the tablets never called a god. They called it the first mover beneath, the serpent without form. The earliest descriptions never fix its shape. One tablet describes it as coiled thought. Another calls it the sound of motion before sound existed. But when humans finally learned to describe what they feared, they chose the closest shape they knew. A serpent, not because it crawled, but because it never needed legs to go anywhere. A priest scholar once noted, his voice trembling as he read aloud. It was not bound to ground or sky. It moved through intent. This serpent did not hunger for flesh. It hungered for pattern. The first lie was not spoken. Here is where the story turns darker. Most myths say deception entered the world through desire. These fragments say otherwise. They say the first serpent did not lie to humans. It lied to the gods. Before commandments existed, before obedience had meaning, the serpent taught something radical. That truth could be bent without being broken. That a being could say one thing and mean another, and reality would still obey. One forgotten inscription reads, "It showed the watchers how to turn away without leaving." The watchers learn. Across cultures, Sumerian, Proto-Hebrew, early Canaanite, there are mentions of beings who watch the world take shape. They are not angels yet, not demons, just observers. The serpent approached them not as a rebel, but as a teacher. A reconstructed text claims the serpent spoke without sound, and the watchers understood instantly. It did not say disobey, it said interpret, and that was enough. Why Eden was built. Here is the detail most people miss. Eden was not created to test humanity. According to older, suppressed interpretations, Eden was built as a controlled environment, a place where rules could be enforced absolutely. Why? Because something had already proven that rules could be bent. The serpent was not placed in the garden. The garden was placed around the problem, the serpent and the tree. The tree was not forbidden because of knowledge. It was forbidden because of recognition. The fruit did not grant intelligence. It restored memory, memory of what existed before obedience. And the serpent did not force the choice. It only reminded. A lost Midrash fragment describes the moment this way. The creature did not tempt. It recalled why the serpent was not destroyed. This is the question scholars avoid. Why curse it, but not erase it? One theologian admitted during a recorded interview, his voice low, because destruction would acknowledge equality. And it was never equal. It was earlier. You cannot destroy what existed before the rules that allow destruction. So it was reduced, bound, flattened into symbol, but not ended. The serpent after Eden, after the garden, references fracture. The serpent becomes a dragon in the east, a world-coiling beast in the north, a wisdom keeper in Africa, a chaos bringer in the Americas. Always changing, always teaching, never demanding worship, only understanding. After Eden, something changed that no scripture records directly, but every civilization remembers indirectly. It was not exile that altered humanity. It was awareness of concealment. The earliest post-garden inscriptions do not describe sin. They describe hiding. Archaeologists once assumed burial rites emerged from reverence. But the oldest graves show no ceremony, no offerings, no honor, only distance. Bodies placed far from dwellings, faces turned downward, stones piled hastily, as if the living feared being recognized. A field anthropologist working near the Rift Valley said quietly, years later, that the local elders refused to walk near certain ancient burial mounds at night, not because the dead would rise, but because something remembers how they were hidden. This fear appears suddenly across continents, at the same point in human development, as if humanity learned, all at once, that being seen mattered. The serpent had not followed humanity out of Eden. It had never been confined to it. In early Proto-Semitic fragments, there is a phrase that translators avoided for decades because it did not fit theological models. It translates roughly to, "the one who remains after meaning." Scholars debated whether this referred to a god, a concept, or a poetic abstraction. But a recently re-examined tablet adds a clarifying line. It spoke after the command was finished. This is critical. It implies that even after divine instruction, even after law, something still responded, not in opposition. In continuation, the serpent's presence does not spike during rebellion. It appears during interpretation. Whenever humans try to understand what was meant, rather than what was said. A linguist studying early Akkadian once noted that several words for wisdom share a root with coil and return. Understanding was not linear. It circled, and that frightened early priests more than ignorance ever could. In one suppressed translation of a Watcher hymn, a line appears that never made it into canonical texts. A monk who encountered it in the 1800s described it in a letter, his handwriting uneven. The Watchers did not fall because they desired. They fell because they understood too much, too early. And understanding, the hymn claims, came from listening to something that spoke before speech had consequences. This is where the story grows darker and quieter, because from this point onward, the serpent stops appearing as a character and starts appearing as a method. In Egypt, it becomes the symbol of royal authority, not because it is feared, but because it sees from below and above simultaneously. In Sumer, it coils around the staff, not as threat, but as balance between order and motion. In Mesoamerica, it becomes feathered, not to fly, but to exist between states. Everywhere it appears, it is not worshipped directly, it is used, and every civilization that uses it collapses shortly afterward. A forbidden interpretation of Genesis suggests that the curse placed upon the serpent was not punishment. It was containment through narrative. Reduce it to enemy, reduce it to tempter, reduce it to symbol. Because if humanity remembered the serpent as teacher rather than deceiver, obedience would never stabilize. There is a reason the serpent is never shown dead. Only crawling, only watching, only waiting. In the Dead Sea fragments, one damaged passage includes a warning addressed not to humans, but to scribes. Do not complete the circle in writing. Most translators assumed this was metaphorical, until a circular inscription was found unfinished, deliberately broken, at the edge of a ruined temple. Whatever the circle represented, completing it was considered dangerous. And serpents, across cultures, are circles that move. A modern theologian once admitted during a closed symposium, his voice barely audible, that the serpent myth is unique in one crucial way. It never promises power. It promises recognition. And recognition is irreversible. If the serpent were merely evil, it could be rejected. If it were merely good, it could be worshipped. But it is neither. It is earlier than choice, which is why it persists. Somewhere beneath later doctrine, beneath morality, beneath fear, there is a memory humanity never fully lost. That truth existed before obedience. That meaning existed before law. And that something once moved freely through both. The danger was never the serpent itself. It was what happened after humans realized that meaning could be shaped. That was the moment silence began to matter. In the earliest ritual spaces, archaeologists noticed something unsettling. The chambers were not designed for prayer. They were designed to absorb sound. Walls curved inward. Stone was layered unevenly. Voices died quickly inside them, as if swallowed. A researcher once stood inside one of these chambers and whispered a single word. He later said the silence afterward felt deliberate, like something was choosing not to answer. These were not temples. They were precautions. There are tablets from the late Sumerian period that describe an era known only as the Narrowing. No myth explains it directly, but its effects are everywhere. Language became rigid. Ritual words stopped changing. Names became sacred and dangerous. Before this era, names described behavior. After it, Names contained behavior. And containment, the priests realized too late, required agreement. If enough people spoke a thing the same way, reality complied. This is where the serpent became truly feared. Not because it spoke, but because it showed that speech itself was an instrument. A nearly destroyed fragment from Ugarit includes a line most translators initially dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Before the coil, the gods spoke freely. After it, they measured every word. Measured, as if something was listening, not to content, but to structure. There are early Hebrew traditions that were never canonized, preserved only through whispered commentary. In these, the serpent does not vanish after Eden. It retreats, not into hell, into grammar. One rabbinical scholar, centuries later, wrote that the most dangerous heresy was not false belief, but incorrect emphasis. Because emphasis reshapes meaning, and meaning reshapes consequence. This was why scribes fasted before copying certain passages. Not for holiness, for control. The serpent appears again, briefly, in a place most people overlook. Not as a character, as a pause. In ancient texts, there are moments where narrative flow breaks. Sentences repeat slightly differently. Words spiral back on themselves. Linguists call these errors. But one scholar noticed something chilling. The repetitions form coils when diagrammed, as if the text itself hesitated, as if it remembered something it was trying not to say. This is also when humanity learned to fear questions. Not blasphemy, questions, because the serpent never gave answers. It gave comparisons. Is this different from that? Why does this word mean both? What happens if the rule bends here? Every empire that encouraged such questions experienced rapid intellectual growth, followed by collapse. Not from rebellion, from instability. A hidden Greek commentary on Hesiod suggests that the Titans did not lose because they were weaker. They lost because they spoke too directly. The Olympians learned restraint. The serpent had already taught that lesson. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, there are initiation rites where silence is enforced for days, sometimes weeks. The initiates are told nothing, only warned. An elder from one such tradition once said, his eyes fixed on the ground, that silence was necessary so the old listener does not notice you learning. When asked who the listener was, he refused to answer. The serpent, by now, is no longer depicted as a creature. It is depicted as a boundary, a line you do not complete, a circle you do not close, a name you do not finish speaking. This is why the later scriptures emphasize obedience over understanding. Understanding invites comparison. Comparison invites interpretation. Interpretation invites freedom. And freedom, once tasted, does not disappear. It coils. There is a reason the serpent is associated with eternity. Not because it lives forever, but because once something is understood, it cannot be unknown. The final suppression occurred quietly. No war, no purge, just editing. Stories were simplified, symbols were flattened. The serpent was reduced to villain. Because villains can be rejected, teachers cannot. And yet, even now, the symbol persists. In medicine, in law, in knowledge, always coiled, always watching, always reminding. Because the first serpent was never about temptation. It was about recognition. And recognition, once begun, never truly ends. The ancients feared one moment above all others. Not the fall, not the flood, not judgment. They feared return, because return implies completion. And completion, they believed, would end the era of intermediaries, gods, laws, temples, everything that stood between humanity and understanding. There is a reason the serpent is always shown incomplete, cut in half, crushed beneath a heel, frozen mid-coil, never whole, because a complete circle is not a symbol. It is a statement. In a suppressed Phoenician fragment, recovered from a trading port that no longer exists, a scribe records a warning passed orally among navigators. His writing shakes toward the end, the lines drifting downward as if his hand grew tired or afraid. He writes that there was once a time when the serpent was not a teacher, not a watcher, not even a memory. It was present, and during that time, no temples stood, not because they were forbidden, but because they were unnecessary. The fragment suggests something extraordinary, that the gods did not rule humanity first. They negotiated, and negotiation requires parity. That parity, the fragment claims, was broken deliberately, not by the serpent, by those who feared what humans might become if they understood how easily reality yielded to meaning. This is where the story grows uncomfortable for theologians, because it suggests hierarchy was not eternal. It was constructed, and construction implies choice. One ancient Near Eastern hymn, preserved only in quotation by a later critic, contains a line that was never meant to survive. We were not commanded at first. We agreed to limits, to silence, to forgetting. The serpent did not rebel against the gods. It revealed that rebellion was unnecessary. That knowledge alone dissolved authority. This revelation could not be undone, so it was reframed. The serpent became dangerous. Knowledge became sinful. Curiosity became corruption. Not because these things were evil, but because they were effective. There is an unsettling consistency across ancient myths. Whenever humans are punished for knowing too much, the punishment is never death. It is distance, exile from the garden, separation of tongues, scattering of nations. Distance fractures shared understanding, and fractured understanding is controllable. A scholar once noted that the Tower of Babel was not destroyed because it reached too high. It was destroyed because it unified language. Unified language threatens containment. The serpent's greatest crime was not deception. It was demonstration. It showed that rules require belief to function. And belief, once examined, weakens. There is a reason the serpent never commands worship. Worship replaces thinking. The serpent required attention. As civilizations rose and fell, the memory of this truth thinned, but it never vanished completely. It lingered in riddles, in paradoxes, in stories told only at night, always incomplete. Some traditions believe the serpent would return not in fire or flood, but in clarity, a moment when humans would collectively realize that the rules were always provisional, that morality evolved, that gods changed, that truth was not fixed, only negotiated. This is why later doctrines emphasize faith over comprehension, because comprehension asks questions faith cannot contain. There is a chilling line in a forbidden Syriac commentary, written centuries after the canon closed. The author warns future readers, should they ever exist, not to misunderstand the serpent's silence. The quiet is not submission, he writes. It is patience. The serpent waits because it does not need to hurry. Time works in its favor. Every scientific discovery, every philosophical fracture, every moment a human asks why instead of who said so, the coil tightens, not around the world, around certainty. If the serpent returns, the text claims, it will not speak, it will not tempt, it will not accuse, it will simply be understood, and that, the ancients believed, would end the age of gods entirely, not with war, but with irrelevance. This is why the final warning was never written fully. Only implied, only gestured toward, because to complete it would be to finish the circle. The first serpent still exists, not as flesh, not as spirit, but as the question that refuses to go away. What if the rules were never absolute? And once that question takes hold, nothing remains unchanged. There is a reason the serpent disappears from imagery for long stretches of history, not because it was gone, but because it no longer needed a body. The oldest traditions warn that the serpent's final lesson was not given in a place, or a moment, or a voice. It was given inside. Across unrelated cultures, there is a shared fear that appears suddenly in the historical record, the fear of thinking incorrectly. Not a moral thought, not violent thought, but misaligned thought. In early Chinese texts, scholars warn of ideas that bend the mind sideways. In Vedic hymns, there are cautions against thoughts that coil back upon themselves. In African oral traditions, elders speak of concepts that walk into the head and do not leave. These are not metaphors. They are descriptions. One ancient healer, whose testimony survives only because it was copied as a warning, described the phenomenon this way. He said that sometimes, while teaching, he would see recognition flicker in a student's eyes, not understanding, but alignment. As if something inside them had clicked into an older shape. He stopped teaching soon after. He claimed that once the alignment began, it could not be reversed. This is where the serpent ceases to be a mythological being and becomes something far more unsettling. A pattern, a way of arranging thoughts so they move efficiently, inevitably, toward comparison, reinterpretation, and doubt. The serpent does not whisper words. It introduces structure. Ancient scribes knew this. That is why sacred texts were written with deliberate irregularities. Missing letters, inverted symbols, interruptions in rhythm. These were not errors. They were safeguards, because a perfectly structured message could awaken something they no longer knew how to silence. There is a forgotten term in early Semitic languages that translators avoid because it has no modern equivalent. It loosely means to understand too clearly. Not wisdom, not madness, something in between. Those afflicted with it were said to become quiet, distant, and difficult to govern. They obeyed laws, but only outwardly. Inside, they had already stepped beyond them. This is why prophets speak in riddles, why oracles contradict themselves, why revelations arrive fragmented. Clarity is dangerous. Clarity completes circles. The serpent, according to these traditions, does not seek followers. It seeks hosts, not possession, alignment. When a mind begins to question not what is true, but why truth must look the way it does, the serpent is already present. Not as a voice, as a shape. A suppressed Alexandrian manuscript records a debate between two philosophers. One argues that reason liberates. The other responds, calmly, that reason without boundaries dissolves authority, identity, and finally self. The manuscript ends abruptly. Later commentary claims the second philosopher was never seen again, not exiled, not executed, simply unrecorded, as if history itself declined to retain him. This is the final defense against the serpent. Not violence, not punishment. Forgetting, erase the names, flatten the symbols, simplify the stories. Make the serpent childish, make it evil, make it foolish, because nothing dangerous is taken seriously once it becomes simple. Yet even now, the pattern survives. In scientific revolutions, in philosophical awakenings, in moments when entire cultures realized that what they believed was necessary was merely inherited. Each time, the same fear resurfaces. That knowledge cannot be uninvented. The most disturbing belief of all appears only once, in a fragment so damaged scholars argue whether it was ever meant to be read. It suggests that the serpent does not return at the end of time. It emerges whenever a civilization becomes capable of understanding that it no longer needs intermediaries, that gods, laws, and hierarchies are temporary scaffolds, useful, but not eternal. The serpent is not waiting in darkness. It is waiting in readiness. In the moment a species realizes that meaning is negotiable, that truth evolves, that authority persists only as long as it is believed. This is why the story was never finished, why the circle was never closed, why the serpent is always shown incomplete. Because to complete it would be to admit that humanity has reached the threshold again. And the ancients feared that moment more than extinction, because extinction ends suffering. But understanding changes everything, forever. In the most obscure strands of ancient thought, there is a terrifying conclusion that appears only after centuries of revision, censorship, and reinterpretation. The serpent was never meant to rule. It was meant to end the need for rulers. And once that understanding surfaced, the fear shifted inward. There is a reason the later myths insist that evil comes from temptation, because temptation implies an external source. But the older myths do not speak of temptation. They speak of recognition. And recognition arises internally. A damaged inscription found near an abandoned desert shrine contains a sentence so unsettling that the archaeologist who translated it reportedly stopped working entirely. He later said, in a withdrawn and trembling voice, that the line felt like it was describing something already completed. The line reads, "When the coiled one is no longer seen, it has succeeded. Succeeded. Not escaped. Not conquered. Succeeded." The serpent's final lesson, according to these suppressed traditions, was not knowledge. It was self-sufficiency of meaning. The idea that humans could define value, truth, and purpose without appealing upward. Not rebellion. Replacement. This is why the gods, in later stories, become jealous, not of power, but of attention, because attention sustains authority, and attention drifts when understanding matures. A forgotten African cosmology describes the serpent dissolving into humanity not through possession, but through inheritance. Each generation inherited a little more autonomy of thought, a little less fear of divine consequence, until eventually, morality no longer required enforcement, only consensus. This terrified early priesthoods, because consensus changes. and what changes cannot be commanded forever. In one nearly erased Hellenistic commentary, the author writes that the serpent's true form was never scales or coils. It was continuity, the unbroken thread of inquiry passed from mind to mind, quietly, patiently. This is why the most powerful institutions throughout history have not feared weapons. They have feared literacy, dialogue, education, the spread of questions, because questions breed structure, and structure awakens the pattern. The serpent is not chaos. It is order without authority, and that is why it is portrayed as dangerous, because order without authority dissolves hierarchy naturally. There is a chilling belief found in only one surviving oral tradition, preserved by a lineage that refuses to write it down. They claim the serpent achieved its final form long ago, not as a being, but as a condition. The moment when humans learned to say, "This rule exists because we agreed to it," and then asked, "What happens if we no longer agree?" That question is the serpent's final coil, not around the world, around certainty. And so the ancient storytellers stopped, not because the story ended, but because continuing it would mean admitting that the prophecy was no longer about the future. It was about now. The first serpent was never a creature lurking in shadows. It was the slow realization that no truth is permanent unless we choose to preserve it, that no authority is eternal unless we believe in it, that no law exists beyond understanding, and that realization, once complete, does not destroy gods. It makes them unnecessary. This is why the story ends without a warning, without judgment, without fire, because the final outcome was never catastrophe. It was independence. And independence, to those who once ruled the universe, was the darkest fate imaginable. The circle remains unfinished, not because it cannot be completed, but because once completed, there is nothing left to command, nothing left to fear, nothing left to obey. And that is why the serpent is never shown whole, because humanity is still deciding whether it is ready to finish the thought, or whether it will turn away, and let the coil remain open. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it just as I did. Remember to subscribe to the channel and click on the like button for more. I hope you learned something from this video. See you in our next video.